Success.
Thanks, Emily. All right, do we think we have everyone, Emily? Do you think there's anyone that's...
I
saw Davis's message, but he's on, so.
I think we're good.
Maria, Emily, this is Kate. I had a lot of trouble getting on, but I just got a message from Maria that wanted to join, and she said that she keeps getting kicked out.
Zoom,
Yeah.
got
I don't know what's going on with Zoom this morning. It was really bizarre.
Yeah.
I don't know, just keep trying, I keep doing, let me join.
Oh, I don't know about anyone else, but Emily, I could barely hear you. You're all like staticky.
Yeah, I think it's my internet line.
Emily, you're muted. Should we proceed, or can you think of any other fixes here?
I'll just keep trying. I don't know.
Okay. Well, as far as I can see, I don't know who we would be missing at this point. So I guess we'll just go ahead and get started. And I'd say if you get kicked out to just try to log back in. Sorry, everyone. Gotta love technology. So good morning, Sue. How's it going in Colorado?
Great. Beautiful day.
Good. So that's Sue Hyatt. She is going to be our presenter for this series. And I think I sent you all a little bit about her bio or her information. I don't know, Sue, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So nice to meet you virtually via Zoom. You know, this is like we get to like sit in a room together days, but you know, when it works, it's great. And when it doesn't, it's a little frustrating. So to echo what Emily and Andrea are saying, it's like, glad you're all here. So I do live in Denver, grew up in Maine though. So, you know, partial to your part of the country. And I've been working with AmeriCorps longer than many AmeriCorps members have been alive. So I started working with AmeriCorps in 1995 on performance measurement and the little bit of evaluation they were doing at the beginning. And, you know, I've had the great fortune to work with programs from all 50 states doing all kinds of things. And what I really like best is some of the stuff that we're going to be getting to do together, which is making sure that you've got all your ducks lined up. So you're talking about your program in effective ways, and you've actually double checked to make sure, you know, what else can you do to make your program even better? So as we go through what we're going to be going through, that's part of what we're going to be talking about. So I also do evaluations for a lot of other organizations, and I'm also all about socially responsible business. But AmeriCorps still is where my heart truly is. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And I've been around for a long time too, as most of you know, and I know Steve Niles, you've been around for quite a while too. And I've had the pleasure of attending some of Sue's sessions throughout the years on performance measures and other different training topics, because she's worked closely with the Corporation for National Community Service and AmeriCorps State and National. So when I saw that she did this type of training, I was really excited, because I was like, oh yeah, I know who she is, I know what she does. So. So just to jump into a little bit, I see a few names on here that I think you work with your organization, but I don't work with you on a regular basis. So I'm Andrea Johnston. I'm the Senior Program Officer at Volunteer New Hampshire. I head up the grant review and primarily responsible for compliance and monitoring of all of the programs, and then kind of helping to lead the team of program officers at Volunteer New Hampshire. So Sue had asked me to talk with you a little bit about why we wanted to do this series. And I think first and foremost, it's always good to have a refresher every few years of following the application instructions, looking at the NOFO. And I would say that that an outside trainer could probably do a better job than Emily and myself, because there's certainly times where we're too close to the program and we miss things, or the program is so new that we get these applications in that are like drafts, and we don't want that. We want your application to come in as a new recompete that it's ready to go. And if we have a few edits and tweaks that we have to make, then we'll do that through clarification, as most of you know. So I would say that that's first and foremost, having a fresh set of training eyes and new ideas as to how to do the different portions of the application. And one of the other reasons is we have a lot of new staff that have started in the past couple of years. Some of you may or may not work directly on the grant in terms of writing it, but we find that it's really helpful that you understand the different pieces, because they are directly tied to your program. And it's also good too, because sometimes staff turnover can be high in these times, and if all of a sudden your program manager is gone and this is thrown in your lap within 6 months to write, then it's nice to have a clue of what you're doing. And we also have several new programs in the past couple of years that have either been funded through formula and are now going into the competitive process, or they've come at it from an outside view of, they're working with a grant writer, but they're not familiar with AmeriCorps and the specific NOFO to AmeriCorps. So sorry about that. My phone won't shut off here. So that's a little bit about why we want to do this. The end result is that you submit a high quality application, and we're hoping by the end of this series that you'll have nailed all of these different sections. And so Sue, I guess if you want to take it away.
Okay. Let's see, can I share, you want to switch over screen sharing so I can show the slides?
Yes.
That would be great. So we're in the process.
Okay.
I am now.
You should be able to now.
Okay, let's see. There we go. Everybody can see this? Yes, I assume so, because I'm not hearing no. Let me click it on here. There. Okay. Just to echo what Andrea was saying, the goal here really is, no matter if you're a program that's been around for a long time, or you're a newer program, or you're a newer staff at an older program, there's always kind of the stress of getting your next grant application ready. And, I think sometimes it's just too easy to say, oh, we're just going to like cut and paste what we did before. But I think what we really want you to do is take the time to really revisit, what is your program really about? And is what you have written a great reflection of that? Because you all have so much in your head about what you're up to and the kind of difference you're making and what your members are doing. So sometimes when you read something on paper, you know exactly what it means. But somebody outside like myself, or if you're going to be going up to the competitive grant review in DC, there's people that don't know what your program's about. And what they're going to judge you on is what they see on the piece of paper. So no matter how long your program's been around, every time you have to write a new grant application, it really is about continuous improvement and how can you continue to tweak how you talk about things. And also the reality is over time, CNCS puts different emphasis on things, and then state commissions have to sometimes change their focus a bit to be able to meet what the funder is looking for with the resources that they grant to you. So it's great to get everybody on the same page and give you a chance to revisit how you've written about what you really want to do for the next grant period. So I already told you a little bit about me. Let me tell you about how we decided what topics to have as part of this Zoom series. So we basically focused on the program design chunks of what CNCS puts out in the NOFO and that Volunteer New Hampshire puts out that you have to respond to. So in this session, we're going to talk about sort of the overview of what we're up to, but then also do a review of the logic model elements the way that CNCS looks at them. If you've come to AmeriCorps from some other type of nonprofit or closely working with other funders, a lot of people use logic models, but CNCS has what they expect AmeriCorps to think about when they're putting one together. And so we want to make sure that you all are really clear, like what's the AmeriCorps way of looking at a logic model, and just to make sure that you have everything in there that you really need to have, because in a way it becomes like the cliff notes for your whole application, especially your theory of change. So in our next session, we're actually going to be talking about theory of change, what are the required elements, and because of the work that I've done for so long, I review a ton of grant applications from a lot of different states. And I want to give you some tips of what it takes to have a really kick-ass theory of change and some of the common missteps that programs make so you don't fall into any of those. So theory of change will be our next topic. Then we're going to talk about everybody's favorite, which is evidence. And as you know, if you've been doing grant writing recently for AmeriCorps, evidence is a big deal. It's, as you'll see in a minute, it's worth a lot of points. And I think out of your grant application, this is the chunk that gives people the most heartburn. It's not that easy to do. That's the reality of it. And the bottom line is, in a grant review, it's worth a lot. So I want to make sure we talk through what is CNCS's expectations of the evidence section. What do they look for? What's Volunteer New Hampshire going to be looking for? And how you can actually maybe find the kind of evidence that they're hoping you're going to find. And if you can't find much, give you some tips on how do you use what you already have to make a strong case. So we're going to spend a whole session on evidence because it is so critical these days. And like I say, I think it's everybody's most hated section of the application. Raise your hand if you agree with me. Yeah. After that, we're going to, in our fourth session, we're going to talk about performance measures and make sure that everybody is up to date with those, especially if you're going into a recompete situation. This is a chance to really think about, are we measuring the right things? Because sometimes, even just a few years ago, there was a lot of pressure to use national measures. And if they don't really fit with what your program is up to, you're kind of doing a disservice. So we're going to talk through how you should look at what you have maybe been collecting data on, which is kind of the compliance piece. Are you doing what you said you were going to do? And figure out if there's something that needs to be tweaked there. And then in our last session, we're going to go over evaluation plans. Anybody that's getting ready to do a recompete has to do an evaluation plan as part of their application. And if that's not you, anyway, it's good to have in the back of your mind because it's going to come up fast. And I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes between performance measurement and evaluation. They're two different things. Evaluation may build off of performance measures, but it really is a separate study, especially if you're a smaller program and you're doing a process evaluation. So I want to make sure everybody understands the distinction. And as you start thinking about what you can do for an evaluation that's meaningful but doable, give you some tips there based on what I've seen a lot of other programs doing. So those are the 5 topics. There, of course, there's other things that are in a grant application that you also need to revisit and do a good job with. And you'll be getting some support from Volunteer New Hampshire about what does it take to do like good budgets and organizational capacity and some of the stuff around member training and all of that. So in the sessions you're going to be doing with me, we're really focusing, as I said, on the program design chunk. So any questions about that? I guess I can't really see the chat right this minute, but if somebody has something, go ahead and put it in. And if Andrea or Emily can like read that out to me, that would be great.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks. Anything coming through?
Nope.
Right. So let me tell you a little bit about how we decided to make this series the most useful. So we're going to do the series of webinars that I just went through. But one of the things that we really wanted to make sure is that this was immediately something you could ask questions about as we're going through it. What I know from having done a ton of Zoom calls, and I'm sure you all are aware of this as well, you know, sometimes it's hard to either unmute and ask a question or type a question into the chat in this kind of a format. But really, I want to strongly encourage you, if anything we're going over during this webinar or any of the other ones, if you've got a question, please absolutely ask it. Because if you leave and you're still confused about something, then, you know, I will feel like I haven't done everything I can for you. So please make sure, like, we're not a huge group. So if you have a question, likely somebody else does too. So please ask whatever comes up. We wanted, you know, sometimes like I've been sitting on a ton of webinars, training webinars lately. There's amazing the amount of things that are being offered for free in the business development space. And, you know, I'm taking my notes, but then I'm not actually doing much with the information. I'm like putting it on the back burner saying I'll get back to it. We really want to push you, because you know you're going to have to be doing a grant application coming up, to push you to put whatever the chunk is that we've just talked about into immediate service by looking at your own stuff. You know, there's only a limited amount of that we can do on a Zoom call, but we're gonna, after each topic, assign some homework. I know everybody hates homework. I wish there a nicer word, but let's just call it what it is. But we want you to take what we've talked about and immediately do something with it. And Volunteer New Hampshire has built in to this whole process, you're going to be submitting your homework to me, and I'm going to give you some written feedback on it. And hopefully that helps you think about what you might want to tweak, maybe allows you to pat yourself on the back, like, yeah, I nailed that. Anyway, we're going to have homework, and then you're going to get feedback. So I see a couple of little numbers popped up. Andrea, does that mean somebody had a question?
We did have, somebody did ask about if this was going to be recorded, and yes, it is going to be recorded. All the sessions will be recorded. Okay.
And Andrea, like, will they get a link to those, or do you post them somewhere? How does that usually happen?
I'll defer to Emily.
Yeah, so we'll post them and then we'll send you a link so you can see them.
So if there's somebody else at your organization, or if you're working with a grant writer and you feel like there's some of the content that we talked about that they would benefit from, make sure you do share that. Or if there was something you were confused about, of course you can send me an email. You can ask Andrea or Emily, or you can rewatch a section of the video again, whatever you're most comfortable with. So just know that you've got a lot of ways. And so I want to strongly encourage you to take advantage of it while it's here. You know, a lot of other states that I work with don't put together a series like this for their programs, and it's too bad. So you guys have this great opportunity to get what you need to make your next application really high quality and maybe be even better than your last one. So take advantage of it. And as I've been saying, like really think continuous improvement. It doesn't mean your last application was bad or there was something wrong with it. But there's always, one of the things that I love about AmeriCorps, it's all about continuous improvement. And something can be good, really good, but there's always something you can tweak to make it just a tad better. So I want to challenge you to not just do a cut and paste job. Like, you've got time now as we go through each of these topics to think about, all right, this is what we said before. Is that still the best we can do, or is there some way we can tweak it? So, and there's no ding. Like, I had a question, excuse me, from a program in another state last week, and they're like, oh no, but if I change my performance measures after 3 years, is that a ding? I'm like, no, that shows you're not asleep at the wheel and that you're taking seriously making sure that you're doing the best job you can. And they've changed their program model slightly based on what they've learned. That's not a ding. It's like, you got to make sure you really are thinking about, okay, what worked really well, and the stuff, just because you did it in the past, maybe some of it is time to let it go. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's something you need to tweak and continue to improve. But anyway, don't just think about this as a process you have to go through because Volunteer New Hampshire requires it of you to get money. Really want you to think about, this is a great opportunity to think about how things have been working, what you want to tweak, and how do you get it on paper. It's all of that.
Yeah, Sue, if I could just say too that we've had a couple of programs over the years and longer standing programs that have changed their performance measures. So, you know, they kind of, they work with what works best for their program and for the model at the time. So it does happen.
So is your deadline still going to be November 6th?
Let's see, Emily, do you have it in front of you?
I don't.
So
That sounds about right. We did try to, we haven't released it yet to everybody, our NOFO, but we did try to coordinate it so that it would be at the end of the series of all of these trainings, and then give some time in between if folks did want to do those one-on-one meetings with you to review some of those sections. So that does sound right.
Okay.
But we'll be sending out that NOFO this week too to everybody.
But even if it's not November 6th, it'll be sometime in that, in that zone. So, it's going to come up really fast. Especially, the thing that's always challenging about the life cycle of AmeriCorps programs is you're working really hard to get this grant year off the ground. At the same time, you're trying to think ahead and get your next application ready. So, these things overlap and makes it a little challenging. So part of what we want to do is give you a nudge to get some of this going sooner rather than later, because then it gives you time to be more thoughtful about it. If it's down to, whoa, it's due next week, what are we going to do? Then, you don't have as much time to really critically think about what you've got on paper and does it reflect what you're really doing. So, as I said, in this, today we're going to go over the series, which we just have. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the application review criteria, some common issues with applications, and then go through the logic model elements. And I've got a few samples of ones that could use a little buff and shine. And sometimes I think it's easier if you look at somebody else's logic model to see where the gaping holes are than if you look at your own. Because like I say, sometimes your brain automatically fills in the holes. You kind of can't help it because you live it every day. So you have to try to step out and have fresh eyes on what you put for all parts of the application, actually. So one of the things that you'll see when the NOFO is released is that CNCS is shifted some of its priorities for the next grant cycle. They do this pretty much every year. And I think this mostly applies, and Andrea or Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, to programs that might go up to the competitive pool to compete for funds. You get a little bit of extra credit if you do one of their priority areas. That said, that does not mean, oh, they're into that this year, maybe we should do that instead of what we've been doing for a long time that we know works and actually really serves the needs of our local community. You don't want to get in the tail wagging the dog thing, thinking you're going to get extra points and so you ought to switch what you're doing. But I want to give you a heads up about some of the things that they're interested in. So don't panic if this isn't what you're up to and you know you're going to go up competitive, especially because if you have a really strong application and you have a really good evidence section and you have a good track record with your performance measures, it's highly likely, you know, that you can get funded. It's not a, oh no, this means I'm at a disadvantage. But that's why if you're not in one of these areas, you have to be in some ways even more careful that the way you describe what your program does is really, really strong, because then you're going to be able to kind of offset the fact that they're interested in some specific things, as they always are. You know, every time they put out a NOFO from the federal level, there's always some things that they focus on. So there's some things that they're focusing on again, and there's some additional things, as you'll see in a minute, that have come up because of COVID-19. Andrea, any special things that you anticipate that are going to be New Hampshire specific? Or do you want to talk about that a little bit after I just give a high level overview of the CNCS priorities? And
Yeah, we can do
we
that.
work between New Hampshire and CNCS. So that's when, after I'm done with this, I'm coming back to you.
Okay.
So economic opportunity, of course, has been a priority area, and preparing people for the workforce is one of the things that they've been interested in for a long time, and that's going to continue. Education, of course, like I'd say the majority of AmeriCorps programs nationally fit into the education category, priority area. And the thing that's new is that they actually say they're going to give a preference to evidence-based interventions that are assessed as moderate or strong, based on some of the things that you might see in the evidence exchange or elsewhere. So in some ways, and that's part of why we're going to do a whole session on evidence, like making sure that you present whatever evidence you have in as clear and strong a way as possible is going to be helpful. And if you don't have evidence, we're going to talk about how to find some. But it sounds like there is a slight shift here. And when we talk about evidence, we'll talk about, they fund programs, especially at the competitive pool, all along the spectrum, the different tiers of evidence. And they're going to give preference to folks that are moderate and strong. I think still the bulk of the country isn't there. They're kind of in pre-preliminary and preliminary evidence. So like, don't panic if you're not moderate or strong, but they do have a bias towards moving people along. And they just gave out some data at the symposium last week that shows that a lot of programs are kind of moving up. So anyway, we won't get too far into that, but that's what they put in their NOFO, is they're gonna give preference to education interventions that are moderate or strong evidence. Environmental stewardship, they just listed without any program model that they're gonna be emphasizing. Healthy futures, they're going towards reducing or preventing prescription drug and opioid abuse. You know, that's been kind of on the books as a priority area for them. So that is continuing. And veterans and military families, models that positively impact veterans quality, and improving military family strength, all of those kind of things are still priority areas. So here's some of, and I know there's a lot on this screen. So here's some of the other things. The two things in black at the bottom are things that you've seen before. Rural intermediaries, you know, they brought back allowing folks to think about being intermediaries. And in a state like New Hampshire, maybe that is a model that you're using or might be interested in using. Faith-based organizations, that's been on the list for a long time. But the new stuff is, if there are programs that are doing COVID-19 recovery activities in any focus area, that's going to get a few extra points. And any program that's actively engaging in what they say straight out of the NOFO is removing structural racial inequities, advancing racial equality, and increasing opportunity in order to achieve sustainable change in communities. Those are something they're also interested in funding. You know, that like the top two and the economic mobility core, in some ways those really are a sign of the times, because with COVID-19 and all the Black Lives Matter movement and a bunch of other things going on in our country that we read about every day in the paper, they have tweaked, you know, what they want to fund to do some things in these areas. Reducing child poverty, that's the clearest I've heard them put that in a while, but there's been programs all along that are geared towards that. So those are the things that, especially for programs going up competitive, that if you're already doing something in one of these areas, then it could get you a little extra credit in the grant review process. If you're not doing any of these, you don't need to worry about it. You just need to write a really good, strong application. And again, you don't want to switch what you're doing because you think you've got a better opportunity to get funding by going for one of these, if it really isn't what your organization's about and it isn't what your program has traditionally been about. If you've already been thinking about making a shift, that's a different thing, but don't let this drive your decisions about what you want your program to be. So Andrea, I'm going to come back to you to add what you'd like to from the Volunteer New Hampshire perspective.
Sure. So we basically in our NOFO, we do support all of the priority areas that CNCS supports. And then we also have what's called our state service plan. And through that, we've identified three major priority areas, and that's education with after-school programming, workforce development. Then we have economic opportunity, which has transportation and food insecurity listed in it. And then we have mental and emotional health. So those are our other three priority areas that we as a state have identified that we will help support. Primarily, we do that through the use of our formula funds. But we would certainly look at an application that has that and put it through competitively as well.
Thanks. So just so you all know, when CNCS puts out its NOFO, it's sort of the minimum requirements that all AmeriCorps programs have to meet, and different states have the power to tweak it and add some additional things on top, or tailor, as Andrea was just talking about, what are some of the content areas that are going to be most useful for New Hampshire. So that's one of the beauties of AmeriCorps, is each, like what we need in Colorado may not be what you need in New Hampshire. So commissions have the ability to, you know, identify what they think is going to be the most good for their state. So we've already kind of talked about this, but another caveat is to get the priority consideration for those things we were just talking about, it has to be a significant part of your program focus, not some little teeny add-on, like hoping, okay, well, we're really doing this, but we're going to do a little bit of that, and hopefully that's going to be enough to get us funded. Again, like if you're not taking it on in a big way, like I wouldn't even worry about it. Like it's way better to have a very strong application no matter what you're doing than trying to put yourself in a pretzel because you think, oh, but that's what CNCS or Volunteer New Hampshire want. Do a really good job with it and describe what you're doing. And if you fit into one of those categories, great. And if you don't, maybe even more so, you got to make sure you got a strong application. Okay, so this is straight out of the CNCS NOFO. So Andrea, if there's any like differences that you anticipate in terms of how New Hampshire looks at it, please like jump in. But in general, and this is not new, this was also last year, when you look at all the chunks of a grant application, the executive summary basically is boilerplate that you slot your stuff in and to give a short summary of your overall application. And you don't actually get any points for that, you just have to do it. And if you're in a recompete stage, you have to do an evaluation plan. That's not listed on here, but you also don't get any points for that. The program design piece, which is part of why Volunteer New Hampshire is offering you this additional training, is because it's a big chunk of what gets looked at during the grant review process. It's worth fully half of the points that are allocated. So as you see, theory of change in the logic model, which is what we're going to talk about today and next time, it's worth 24% of the 50%. Evidence is worth almost as much because if you add the two chunks together, it's 20 points out of 100. And the notice priority you just have to do it. That doesn't come with any percentage, and member experience is worth 6 points out of 100. But the program design piece, the heavy duty 2 sections are theory of change and logic model, which kind of gets lumped together, and evidence tier, which is 20 points. So that's again why we're going to do one whole section on evidence. And we'll make sure everybody gets the distinction between the tier and the quality, and because I think that stuff can be pretty confusing. So the other 2 areas that are worth 25% or 25 points each, organizational capacity and your cost effectiveness and budget adequacy section is worth another 25 points. All right, so any questions on sort of the big picture around grant applications and which sections get looked at before we jump into the logic model section?
I would just add, Sue, that from a review standpoint at the commission, we see the most problems, I would say, in the program design, really making the connection from the logic model to the actual program design itself. And in the narrative, there's often times where we have to even understand what they're trying to do, what the problem need is and how they're going to fix that, is we have to reference the logic model, and oftentimes they don't match up. Yeah. And that becomes very frustrating. So.
Absolutely. You know, I think to build off that, one of the things that I think frustrates a lot of programs when they're doing their applications is it feels like you have to be repetitive because you're presenting the same information, maybe in an expanded form or a summary form in multiple places. And that's true. And you have to treat each section as it's sort of a standalone. So your logic model, and we're going to talk about this now, like needs to be really closely aligned, as Andrea was saying, with your narrative, which really is the logic model in words, more expanded with your theory of change. And for those of you that are doing evaluation plans, you have to do a summary of your theory of change in your evaluation plan. You can't have people refer back to another section of your application. And in the performance measure section, you have to give your problem statement. You have to talk about your intervention. So you're talking about exactly the same stuff in multiple places. And it needs to sound the same, just like Andrea was saying. It's like sometimes I have to look at people's logic models because they did the best job there. So that's one of the things that you're going to need to really double check for yourself is, does your logic model and your theory of change, is it absolutely tied together? The theory of change, it's going to be longer. It's a narrative. It's in some ways giving more detail about what you put in your logic model. But these things, this isn't a creative writing exercise. You've just got to be really clear and make sure you're talking the same thing everywhere. Andrea, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that sums it up.
So let's dive in on what's in a logic model, just as a review, and we'll talk about what are some of the common challenges that we see with those sections. I've got some things, and Andrea, please jump in and share some of the things that you've seen over time that you'd like to make sure people avoid as well. But I do just want to really highlight that your logic model and your theory of change, just as Andrea was saying, need to sound really the same. So in a theory of change, you're not necessarily going through all the stuff about inputs, but the problem and need statement need to sound the same. It's probably shorter in the logic model, but sometimes the activity section in a logic model is a little too short. And then there's the whole outcome piece. But let's break this down one piece at a time. So the first section of a logic model is the problem. Whoops, I just lost something here. All right, there we go. The first section of the logic model, and it used to be a standalone section in the program design narratives. Now, and I think that was confusing for some people before, because problem statement used to be a section and then they wanted the theory of change. But the reality is the problem statement is the first part of a theory of change. So anyway, in the logic model, the problem statement is the first column. And this should give enough information so that somebody that doesn't know anything about your program can look at your logic model and figure out what's the specific thing that the activities and outputs and outcomes that you're putting in your logic model, what's the specific problem those have been designed to address. In some ways, the problem statement and the outcomes are the flip side of the same coin, because what you're hoping to change should relate to what the problem is. So you have to give enough information in the problem section so that somebody understands what's going on in the areas where your members are going to be serving, that this part of your program is going to address. So some of the common things I've seen in this section is, and you'll see when we look at some of the samples I pull, there's not enough detail. And and there's no stats. It's not even a clear statement of the problem. Sometimes instead of really talking about the problem, what folks do is give a justification of their program model or talk about their past successes, or how they've seen their program model reduce outcomes in the past. They're talking about stuff that doesn't really fit with just clearly stating what's the problem your program is designed to address. So if it's kind of squishy in the logic model, it's hard to understand if what you're proposing actually makes sense. Because if it's not clear what the problem is, it's like, it's harder to say, okay, this set of activities, I can see how that's gonna take on that problem and help improve it. Andrea, anything that you've seen with problem statements or things you'd like to see?
Yeah, I would say, so one of the common things that we see, especially with newer applications, is they really don't have any data or statistics or anything really current to back up what they're saying the problem or need is. And even when we've gone through again and told them, all right, you really need to dig deep and find out what, like put something in here to back this up. And sometimes they don't, or it's just very outdated, or it just doesn't, it's not supporting what it is that they're trying to do. So that I would say is one of the biggest issues that we encounter. And Emily, do you have anything?
Yeah, I would also say that a lot of the times, and like you said, especially in maybe newer applications, that the problem that they identify sometimes has nothing to do with what their interventions are, so they don't really match. So they'll say a problem, but then their program will only be connected to the problem, like if you get down to the basics. So that's always make sure that the problem that you're identifying is what has to do with what your program's about.
Yeah.
And then I'd also make sure that it's to really drive home that it's significant as well. I mean, I'm sure all the programs that we have are, but sometimes it's hard to kind of, especially with, like what Andrew was saying, with data, like if the data is missing or if it's all anecdotal information, it might be a little bit harder to kind of to prove or back up that the problem that you're identifying is actually significant.
Thanks. So one of the things that we'll talk about with theory of change, but I think it actually applies here as well, and it builds off what Emily was just talking about, is sometimes people think about the problem or community needs statement is like the kitchen sink approach to everything that's wrong in a community. And like trying to show that there's a lot of need, but not having it closely tied to the activities or intervention that the program's doing. In some ways, it's contextual information, but sometimes it's one or two layers out from what the program's actually taking on. So one of the things that I suggest you do, especially in the narrative where you have more space, but also here in the logic model, is the problem that you're presenting what's specifically related to what you're going to be doing. Like, so say you're an after school program, like what's the need that specifically goes to that? And I'm being a little facetious when I say, people say that there's like water quality issues and, like they toss in a lot of other needs in a community, but yes, they do exist, but they're not directly related to what the program's about. So leave that stuff out. It may be good for you to keep in mind for some reason, but just keep this clean, simple, only the problem that relates to your program design. And as we're going along, if you have questions on any of this, please either unmute yourself and just jump in and ask, or be sure to type in the chat what you are curious about, and we'll make sure that we get those answered. Inputs is the next section of the logic model. And this is really, what's it going to take to do the activities that you're about to present also in the logic model? What are the resources that you need. So the things that CNCS says AmeriCorps programs should put in their logic model are how many members you're going to have, like how many locations and sites where members are going to serve. But then there's other examples of things you might put in the input section as well. Like if it requires other funding for program materials or training or something, you might include that in there. The program staff training you're going to give members. If you're going to use volunteers to work in tandem with members, you might mention that in there. If it's that you need specific curriculum materials or other sorts of things, it's like, what do you need to do the intervention that you're proposing? So some of the things that I've seen that are common issues in logic models, again, as we'll probably see pretty much across the board, not enough detail. And a lot of folks don't mention the number of members or locations, and that is something that CNCS is quite clear in its NOFO that it wants you to make sure you put in there. And again, you've got the number of members probably in 45 places in your application, and it has to be here too. So don't forget that. So Emily or Andrea, anything on inputs that you'd like to add?
Same issues. Yeah, just not following the instructions, not putting in, number of members, and yeah, not enough detail.
And I think sometimes, especially with maybe newer programs, you might not necessarily know exactly maybe the locations or sites where your members will be if you're still in talks about gathering partners or something. But I would say at least put, the towns that you want to have it in, or the general kinds of places to, try to be as specific as possible.
And thinking back on the problem statement, one of the things I didn't mention, then we'll talk more about it when we're talking theory of change, where you've got more space to do more. Make sure that if you're giving stats, they're as relevant to as close to where you're going to serve as possible. So you all are in New Hampshire. So if you don't have local stats that are directly related from your community or the communities where you're going to be working, having members serve, at least use New Hampshire stats. It's probably better not to use federal statistics. In the US, this is a problem. Okay, maybe, but why are you doing this kind of service in New Hampshire? So make sure that your problem statements directly relate to the local issues. Like in a theory of change, you might also put in some US figure to kind of compare how New Hampshire also has this issue. Or maybe whatever you're working on, maybe it's more extreme in New Hampshire and you want to make that point. That's why you're really focusing on having your members serve in that way. But using a lot of US stats is, I would discourage you from doing much of that.
Yeah, I'd like to add too, Sue, that we might operate a little bit differently in New Hampshire. And as Sue had mentioned when we started the session, that every state does operate their NOFO a little bit differently. We all have the standard CNCS criteria, but then we have some leadway to go ahead and add on different components to our NOFO. So in New Hampshire, we instituted a couple years ago that to apply for funding with this, you've either had to have prior experience operating a national service program, or you've had to have a planning grant with us. So I guess with that, we've expected that they take that planning grant time to really flesh out a lot of, what it is that they're going to be doing, not just the problem need, but, what are those sites? How many members are they going to use? Just all of the different details. So I guess in a sense, we expect a higher quality application when we get it, just from asking for that prior national service experience or that planning grant year.
So you all got to do this stuff really well. Okay, the next section are the activities. And this is where you put in the logic model what your members are going to be doing, like what they're doing, who they're doing it with, where they're doing it, and it's got to have enough detail. Like the things on the screen are the things that are the minimum expectations that CNCS puts in there. You have to mention who the target population is. And a piece that a lot of folks leave out is the whole dosage piece. Maybe they say we're going to be doing after school tutoring in English and math, but then they don't say how often do members meet with kids. Is it every day? Is it once a week? And then, like, is it for 15 minutes? Is it for a half an hour? Like, how much, like, time is it? Is it one-on-one? Is it small group? And part of the reason that this is so important is because somebody needs to be able to see at a glance what's the activity that you're having members do, because that sets the frame to really understand how many people can you serve given this level of intensity of interaction between members and people, or if it's environmental program with what they're doing out there. And it also sets the stage to understand, okay, are these realistic outcomes given the amount of interaction a member is having with whoever they're serving? For example, like an English tutoring program that meets with students once a week for 20 minutes, and they're in a small group, cannot realistically have the same, not that that program is not going to do good things, but when you look at how many kids are going to improve by how much, which is the outcome part, like it can't have, that program is not going to be able to have as much impact with those kids getting the English tutoring as another program that does one-on-one with students 3 times a week for 20 minutes. You know, that's much more intensive kind of relationship and service that that student is getting. So one would expect that those students maybe can show a little more growth because they have more time with a member. So being clear about this, I think, is really important, because not only it helps you be clear what the expectation is of what you're going to train your members to do, like how much are they expected to interact with whoever they're supposed to be engaging with. But it gives you kind of okay, this is the criteria, and it allows anybody looking to say, all right, are these outcomes realistic? So one of the things that I think that I see a lot is sometimes programs that do multiple things, they just kind of run it all together in the logic model, instead of, if you really have 2 major chunks of your program, say, like put a line in there and put the one on top and the other one underneath. And Andrea or Emily, I'll have you say if this is what you want for New Hampshire. But one of the things that's hard is sometimes people like write up everything all together. And so when you look at a logic model and then you read across it, it's hard to know, okay, they're saying these are the outcomes, but which activity goes with what? So the easiest way is to put, have different rows in the logic model for different, if you've got more than one major activity that you're writing up. And keeping in mind that none of this can go, your logic model can't be more than 3 pages. So again, in this section, not enough detail, and then no dosage, frequency, duration kind of info are some of the common issues. So Andrea, Emily, what would you like to add?
Again, I just echo Sue, the same common issues, not enough detail. Emily, anything else?
Nope, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, it should be able to be readable and be like, okay, this is what this program is going to do. There shouldn't be a question, I guess.
Yeah, we've come across logic models before too, where they were not readable. So.
Well, and you know, for those of you writing applications, like the clearer you can be, so that an external person reading it has it, they don't have to work overtime and they're not having to flip around in the application. It like that cuts down on the stress and it just makes it clearer. Like the goal is to make it as easy and as clear as possible. So I can't underscore, like you might have it all in there, but if it's not where it needs to be, don't assume that somebody's going to go the extra inch and connect the dots for you. It looks like maybe another question came in. I saw the number go up. Yes, no?
Yes, let's see. It looks like, how is the committee taking into consideration the uncertainty of COVID-19? Last year's plan was put in place before it was even on the horizon. It has been very difficult to implement our plan.
Anything you want to say from the Volunteer New Hampshire perspective?
Well, I mean, we've been working with CNCS off of their guidance to be very fluid with COVID-19, and they've made a lot of adjustments throughout the past 6-7 months, and in terms of suspension with members, and even in terms of you know, data collection and meeting your performance measures. I mean, right now our NOFO is going off of what CNCS has put out, and we will certainly continue to be fluid as things change with the guidance of CNCS.
Well, and Andrea, would it be correct to say to plan not with COVID as what is the environment?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, to certainly go along with your intended program model. We've made some adjustments too in terms of assisting programs right now with CARES Act funding. The majority of all of National Service programs are receiving some smaller grants, I guess, funds from us, sub-grant agreements with us in terms of, you know, assisting with access to technology, training, PPE, things like that. So I would say go about your intended model, unless you are, we do have a program that's working on some COVID specific activities. So that is different. So.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Oh, go ahead, Emily.
I was going to say, and if it's any consolation or what have you, I mean, the application that you will be submitting will be for next year. So like this upcoming, probably, I don't know what program you're part of, Robin, but in the fall. So maybe in a year from now, COVID will be maybe a little bit more, I don't know, alleviated.
Yeah. We'll all keep our fingers crossed on that, Fred.
Yeah, I guess I would say too to that, Emily, because you brought up something that just hit my memory here of the problems that you are addressing and the community needs right now. They're probably not going to change. If anything, they're going to be intensified by COVID. So
a great point. Yeah, sadly, that's That's an accurate point. Not a great woohoo point, but yeah, accurate point. And, I think there's how you can plan to the best of your ability, what's it going to look like and what a member's going to be doing. And then if in the end it turns out that you can't deliver the way you intended and or your performance measures are not able to happen in the way that you thought they were going to, that comes into the reporting phase, which is where I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility of state commissions to really think about, okay, so you didn't meet your target and you explain it, well, it's because we weren't doing one-on-one tutoring, we were doing remote tutoring, but a lot of our kids didn't have Wi-Fi or, whatever. So like, that's, I think, especially where you're going to have the opportunity, if things turn out that they continue to be impacted, that's where you can talk about how COVID has changed what you're doing, as opposed to planning the next 3 years, assuming COVID, unless you're a COVID program, that's kind of a different ball of wax. But I think for the rest of you, what are you going to do? And maybe there's some language in there that you'll do in person and or virtual. I don't know. You have to, that's an individual program choice, I think. All right, moving right along. Outputs, I think this is just, what are you going to count to show that you delivered the service as planned? And CNCS has a bias that and you don't need to put in here every single thing that you're going to count as a program for your own internal tracking and use purposes. But what's the key thing you're going to count for your AmeriCorps performance measures? And CNCS, if you're not an environmental program, their bias is they want you to count the number of people that get served, not how many workshops happen. You may count that for some other reason, but what they want to know is, okay, if you did 5 workshops, at the end of the day, how many people attended those? So that's the number that you really should be reporting here. And I think for most programs, if you are in one of the CNCS major priority areas, education, economic opportunity, that level of stuff, there is a national measure that's number of people served. So for most of you, you're probably going to use that national measure, ED1A or, so they also want you, instead of just saying number of students served, put in what the national measure is that it relates to. What the issues I see here, sometimes people are trying to cram outcomes into the output section, and sometimes they list like 10 things they're going to count. And, then it makes it a little hard to see, well, what's the main thing? Because again, this has to clearly relate to your performance measures when you're looking at that section. So I would say don't put in 10 things. Andrea or Emily, am I on the right track with what Volunteer New Hampshire likes?
Yes. I would send to listing too many other things in there, and everything else just gets, the bigger ones just get lost. So.
Okay. The outcome section, as you know, there's 3 chunks to this. And basically, the way AmeriCorps has looked at it, they give some sense of what it is for most programs to be in each category. And the thing to think about here is what's going to happen first, what happens next if that first thing happens, and then what's the long-term outcome. And we'll talk some more about this with theory of change, but the piece here to keep in mind is, what they really want to know is the service your members are giving now is putting people on a path towards some longer term outcome. So if you're trying to teach people about something around nutrition education, say, maybe you're trying to increase their knowledge about what's healthy eating. Maybe you're trying to change their attitude about why they ought to eat vegetables. And maybe the long-term thing you hope is that they're going to be healthier. You're not going to have to measure that necessarily. Like, the short-term outcome is usually what can you get to in 1 year? And that's what you're going to measure for your performance measure, usually. And there can be exceptions to that. Maybe the short-term thing is something more immediate, and you're going to measure the medium-term outcome if it happens within 1 year for your performance measures. But these things need to build on each other and not start going in separate directions. Sometimes one of the things I see is people are pretty clear on the short-term outcome, but then the medium-term outcome starts going in a slightly different way direction than what they said the problem was. But then sometimes the long-term outcome goes someplace different. Like, it should sound like it's all on the same path and kind of builds on each other, which doesn't mean everybody is going to experience it as you want it to be. But you need to lay out, okay, if we do this, if our members do this now, how are people going to be better off? And then if they're better off in this way, what's that mean? What's next? What do we hope happens? And then if that happens, then what happens? So, and again here, even if you're not going to measure it, like for the long-term outcome, if you're doing an applicant determined measure, and we'll get more into all of this when we talk about performance measures, then maybe this doesn't relate, but if you're using a national measure for one of your outcomes, you need to put in there what it is. So is it ED27C? Like, what's the number? Like, what's the shorthand for that?
Can I ask a question? Do you mind, Sue?
Yeah.
About 10 years ago, we had a program officer who was like, the most important thing is to sort of like do what you do well and stay focused on that. And if you can meet a national performance measure, then measure that. It might not be, exactly what you're doing, but, measure that to show the work you're doing and allowing the corporation to, build its, numbers across the country to sort of those national performance measures help, gather the data from hundreds of programs across the country.
Right.
But it does create sort of in a way, sometimes a like split personality when you're trying to write your proposal. Particularly in the logic model section, if you're, you're showing both how you're meeting a standard performance measure and you're doing your good work that you've been doing for a while and are strong at.
Yeah.
Do you mind talking a little bit about how to
Sure.
bridge that gap?
Yeah. So I think the newer tone is like, because I've done performance measurement training for a long time, like some years ago, it's exactly what you're talking about, Steve, where people were really sort of pressured to pick a national measure for exactly the reasons you're talking about. Because they wanted to be able to roll things up and have what they thought was going to be a stronger presentation when they go to Congress to say why there should be, ongoing funding. But I think what CNCS learned, and the AmeriCorps unit specifically, is that people can turn in numbers that go towards a national measure, but sometimes they're not that accurate, especially, and sometimes programs don't look like they're doing that well because they were trying to pigeonhole themselves into something that wasn't really what they were doing. So in the last couple of years, they've actually changed the language, and you'll see this when the guidance comes out from Volunteer New Hampshire. In the performance measurement instructions, if there is not a national measure that gets at what you're going for, it's way more okay to once again have an applicant determined measure, and that's not a ding. But what you can't do is slightly change the wording and have it basically duplicate something that's a national measure. If it's close enough and you can do a national measure, they still prefer you to do that. But if there isn't one that matches what you're up to, don't use it, because it's only a disservice to you in the long run and maybe masks the true impact of what your members are doing. So that's what, like the newer guidance, they've backed off the national measure thing. So, but if you had picked one, then they want you to indicate it in your logic model. If you're doing an applicant determined measure, that's more okay than it was like 3 to 5 years ago, since the whole national measure thing kind of first started. So if there really isn't one that matches, don't use one. Use your own.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Maria or Emily, anything you want to add?
Nope.
Nope.
Okay. Well, we're wrapping it down here. So I wanted to show you some logic models and to point out, based on what we just talked about, where there's some issues. So the first two I'm going to share, like, for sure have some issues. Like, this is always like continuous improvement. So even the third one, that's pretty good. You know, there's still a buff and shine that could happen with that. But I picked the first two to make a few points. So as you can see in the problem section, all they said was youth unemployment. That's way not enough information. Like, that's the super boiled down summary. Youth unemployment where? And what age youth? And how big a problem is it in the areas where this program is going to operate? Like, that is definitely not enough information. So if you look at the input section, they say how many members they're going to have. Don't quite know what, I guess those last three things are partners or sites where members are going to serve. It's not quite clear. Like, and just listing AmeriCorps as a bullet. Like, what does that mean actually? So make sure when you're looking at your inputs, like, yes, they got to check off for listing number of members. Presumably those others, like, and they're calling it work sites. You know, you got to be careful of language. Service sites. Because remember, it's not work. This is service. And then why there's just a bullet that says AmeriCorps? Well, yeah, okay, of course. So those are my comments on that one. When you look at this, they set up their logic model to focus on the members as opposed to the service that the members are doing in the community. So all AmeriCorps programs have to do member development, because this is probably a Youth Corps model. You know, they did their whole logic model based on members, but then they're saying the problem is youth unemployment. Like, they didn't lay out enough of the problem, and really the activity that you put in your logic model should be about the service that members are giving to the community, and what does that look like. So This is all about what the members are going to get. So that's kind of an issue out of the gate. And then everything else follows from that. Their outputs were, even if members was the activity that was okay to have, the output should be number of members that get these things. And that's not in there anywhere. Like in some ways, like the individual development plan, like why that, if you counted those and there was every member had one, in some ways that's maybe how you would measure how many people got served. But the OSHA training, the CPR first aid training, those are probably inputs. That's stuff that the members would need. And then their outcomes, like they put down lots of things, and how they get to literacy and numeracy, you know, from an OSHA training, you know, I don't know. Like these things don't line up, and it shouldn't be about what members get out of the program anyway. So let's look at another quick example here because we're just about out of time. So this one, low academic performance, particularly in math and reading. It's a little bit clearer, but again, there's no stats. We don't know where this is. This isn't just that I sanitized this one. It's like it wasn't in there. No stats. The inputs, cash and in-kind support for what? Providing tutoring in math and reading, but again, the dosage isn't there. It's like, that's what, but who are they doing it with? Where are they doing it? How much interaction do members have? It looks like it's individual and groups, but then family outreach is in there. That may be a separate line because that's kind of starting down a different path. So number of students tutored, that's what, ED1A. So it should say that. Number of student contact hours, a program needs to know that because that's how you're gonna also help determine who to do on, but it doesn't need to be in here. Number of family contacts maybe goes toward, but number of contacts is not the thing to count for this. That you count it for other reasons, absolutely. But it would, if there was going to be something for family outreach, it's how many families, and then how many people does that mean? Understand key concepts in the areas of math and reading. What does that mean? Like, it's just not quite clear enough. And it doesn't say which, there's national measures kind of for all of this. Education is, there's lots of that. So that should be in there. And then this one is a bit better. There's more information in the problem statement. It's clear in the inputs, the activities, gives a sense of the dosage. It talks about how many of who and which national measures they're using. Excuse me. So like I said, you could still tweak this, but this one, I hope you can see, just looking at it quickly, is way better than the past two. So I can take any questions, but let me just tell you what your homework is, that if you can do it, because our next session is next Monday. So if by Friday close of business, what I'd like you to do is revisit your logic model if you have one, and tweak it if you need to based on what we've been talking about today. And if you don't have one, develop one. But what we're asking you to do is email them to me Friday. I'm going to give you written feedback on what I see and give you some tips about how you could make it stronger for your next draft. So that's your homework. And I know it's because we're keeping you on a tight timeline. So I know everybody's really busy, but this is like a great opportunity to take a chunk of what you're gonna have to do for your grant application, jump into it now, do a first crack, get some feedback. So when after the request for applications is released, you're gonna be, if you stay up with us and do the assignments as we go along, you're gonna be just that much further ahead. And I know we've run a little over because we had some issues on the front end, but Andrea or Emily, anything you'd like to add as we're wrapping down?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, for those of you that are just, we'll be submitting a continuation application. I would say more than half of our programs are, that I would still go ahead and take a crack at your logic model. Either, look at what you have submitted in your last application, or tweak it to get Sue's feedback. If anything, it's just going to confirm what you're doing is right on track, or it's going to improve it. So I really encourage you to do that.
Okay, any questions that anybody has before we sign off for today?
Nothing in the chat box, so.
I don't hear anybody speaking up, so.
Then you must have done a fantastic job, Sue. You covered everything.
Yeah, right.
Definitely, definitely.
Okay, bye everybody. Great to meet you virtually and see you next week. And I look forward to seeing your logic models and giving you some feedback. So take care, and we'll be talking soon.
Yes.
Right.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Sue. See you next week.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a good
Take care. Thanks so much.